Добрый вечер в клубе Е-20 профессор Илья Сомин. Club E20 welcomes Professor Ilya Somin. Ilya, would you please introduce yourself?
My name is Illya Somin. I'm a law professor at George Mason University. I write about a wide range of issues in constitutional law, property law, also issues related to federalism and migration rights. And today, as you already know, we're going to be talking about the Israeli judicial reforms that have been proposed by the government currently in power. And to put it mildly, those reforms are extremely controversial. As Evelina said, I will be doing the presentation in English. However, I'm happy to take questions in Russian as well, or even in French if anybody wants to ask questions in that language. And there will be time for questions at the end of the presentation, so please save your questions until then. I'll start with an overview of the Israeli political and legal system and how it works. I apologize in advance to those of you who already know a lot about Israeli politics, and this material might already be familiar to you, but Evelina asked me to go over this because I know maybe not everybody is familiar with this. Then I'll explain what the proposed judicial reform is, and I'll talk about also why I'm against it. Finally, I'll talk about some parallels between the Israeli situation and the debate over judicial review here in the United States. There are important differences between their situation and ours, but there are also some similarities as well. And ironically, the one that most immediately jumps out, if you have studied both situations, is that the kind of reforms that the political right wants to push through in Israel are actually similar to those that some people on the political left want to push through in the United States. In both cases, they really badly want to diminish the power of the judiciary and strengthen that of politicians and political majorities, and they have that in common, even though their reasons for doing so are somewhat different, and obviously the structure of the two political systems is different as well. So let's start by talking a little bit about the Israeli political system and how it works. As Evelina mentioned, Israel has no written constitution. In 1949, they actually elected a constituent assembly that was supposed to write a new constitution, or really the first constitution in their history, but they could not agree on what would be in the constitution. So instead they said, we're not a constituent assembly, we're the parliament, which in Israel is called the Knesset. They created a law for electing new parliaments. And ever since then, the Israeli government has functioned without a written constitution. In this respect, it's somewhat similar to the British government, which also does not have a written constitution. So unlike in the United States and most other countries, which do have constitutions which explain, at least in some detail, what the branches of government are and what their powers are and how they're supposed to work. In Israel, all of this is based on a combination of tradition and political norms and laws enacted by the Knesset, which, as I've already mentioned, is their parliament. So the first thing to know about the Knesset and the Israeli government is that the Knesset has 120 seats, and they are elected by proportional representation. That is, any political party which gets at least 3.25% of the vote is entitled to a proportional share of seats in the Knesset. As a result, instead of our political system where we have only 2 significant parties, they usually have as many as 10 or 15 parties which have seats in the Knesset. And then after an election, they form a coalition government that the parties get together and negotiate. And if they can get to a government that has 61 seats, then those coalitions keep being in power and can form the government until the coalition falls apart, or until it's time for a new election, which is usually supposed to be in 4 years. But in recent years in Israel, most governments don't last that long, and elections happen much sooner than that. So, and the prime minister usually is simply the leader of the largest party within the coalition, or really whoever the coalition coalition decides will be the prime minister, and then they give out other ministries, the defense ministry, the foreign ministry, various economics ministry, the education ministry, and so on. The parties in the coalition decide among themselves who will hold those positions. And all of the political power, almost all of it, rests in the hands of the majority in the Knesset. And this is, especially by comparison with the United States, this is a very centralized political system. There's no separation of powers. There is no executive branch, which is separate from the legislative branch. The prime minister, who's the head of the executive, comes from the legislative branch. There is also no system of federalism. Israel does have local governments, but those local governments ultimately are under the complete control of the Knesset. If the Knesset wants to pass a law taking away their powers or changing how they work or even changing their boundaries, they can do that. And so this is a government that, compared to the US government and compared to many other democracies, is very, very centralized. All the power, or almost all the power, rests in the hands of whatever coalition can get 61 seats in the Knesset and hold on to them and continue agreeing among themselves. This centralization is a real problem because Israel, although it's a small nation, it's very diverse. There are big disagreements and differences between different groups in the population. Obviously, there are divisions between the political left and the political right. There are also big divisions between more religious Jews and more secular Jews. And of course, a division between the 80% of the population, which is Jewish, and about 20%, which is non-Jewish. And of course, that includes, in addition to that, many immigrants who are themselves not Jewish, though they came as relatives of Jews. As many of you know, many Russian immigrants to Israel are like this. They are people who are not ethnic Jews, but were able to immigrate to Israel because they are relatives of people who are Jews under Israeli law, and they sometimes have different views and interests than people who are Jews might have. So although the country is small, it's very divided. And when a country is very diverse and divided, that makes a highly centralized government more dangerous than if we're talking about a society where everybody agrees among themselves more and there are not many divisions. Although Israel has no written constitution and therefore does not have a system of judicial review, which is created by the Constitution, it does have a judiciary. And I guess I'll start this topic by noting what judicial review is. In countries that have constitutions like the United States or Canada or Germany or many others, there is also a judiciary where if you believe, for example, that the government has violated your constitutional rights, you can go to court and say, I'm making an argument that this law violates my constitutional rights. And the court can then say, well, yes, we agree with you. And if they agree with you, if the court decides that the law or the regulation is unconstitutional, then the law gets struck down and the government is not allowed to enforce it. And this is called the system of judicial review, which exists in the United States and in many other countries. In Israel, at first, it did not exist. At least not to any significant degree, because as I said before, there is no written constitution, so nobody could point to a law which is a higher law than the others on the basis of which a court could say that something the government did was unconstitutional and therefore needs to be struck down. However, over time, the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, has adopted a series of special laws that are called basic laws, which in Israel have a status similar to that of a constitution, but not quite. The idea is that these basic laws, although they still are just laws enacted by the Knesset, they have a higher status than other laws. And so if a normal law is passed that conflicts with a basic law, then over time, the rule has developed that the courts can say this law violates a basic law and therefore it is illegal and it can't be enforced. And similarly, The same goes for regulations adopted by government agencies. Beginning in the 1990s, now almost 30 years ago, the Israeli Supreme Court and also Israeli lower courts have begun to exercise judicial review more, particularly after the passage in 1992 of the two most important basic laws. One of them is the Basic Law on Human Freedom and Dignity, which protects a variety of civil liberties like freedom of speech, freedom against imprisonment and detention, property rights, and some others. Then there's also the Basic Law on Occupational Freedom, which protects the right to choose the profession that you want. None of these rights are completely unlimited. There are restrictions on them, both in the basic laws themselves and under the doctrine that has been developed by the Israeli Supreme Court. But the Israeli Supreme Court and through it lower courts have since the 1990s exercised the power of judicial review, which is similar, at least in many ways, to the power of judicial review that American courts have, though many of the specific rules are a little bit different, and I can get into the differences if people are interested, but the basic idea is that over time, the Israeli Supreme Court and other Israeli courts have managed to develop a power of judicial review, even though Israel does not have a written constitution, because these basic laws have been treated as if they have a constitutional status, though everyone does agree that in principle, the Knesset could pass a law saying this is a special new basic law, which eliminates or changes some of the old basic law, and then there will be a new basic law that takes precedence over the old one. However, at least under the current rules, they cannot pass just a normal law and say that that can violate the previous basic laws. I should also mention that in the current system, the way that Israeli judges are appointed is through a complicated system where the biggest influence in the decision-making is wielded by other judges. That is, there's a committee of current judges that selects new judges. There is also a role for the Ministry of Justice and for the elected government, but they don't have as much power over the selection of new judges as the old judges do. And this system has been a subject of complaint, particularly by the political right in Israel, where they say that this gives the judges too much power. And also there have been complaints in the past that Ashkenazic Jews, that is people like us, people descended from Jews who immigrated from Europe, are more likely to be selected than Sephardic Jews, that is Jews from the Arab world. And also in the past, it was the case that Jews were more likely to be selected than Arabs or members of other minorities, though in recent years, there have been more Sephardic judges and also more Arab judges as well than in the past. But there is this complaint that there is these biases in the selection process. And some people also argue that it's unfair if the judges, to a large extent, get to choose their own successors. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about the reforms that are being proposed, but I will mention that over the last 30 years, the Israeli Supreme Court has often done a lot to protect various civil liberties in Israel against the government, including liberty against imprisonment, free speech rights, and also property rights. I have to admit that in one decision, they even cited one of my articles on property rights, even though if it were up to me, I would have cited it differently. But I think they reached the right conclusion in that case. But that's not why I like the Israeli Supreme Court. I like it not because they cited my work, which frankly, they could have done without citing my work. I like it because they do, in fact, do some valuable work in terms of protecting civil liberties, limiting the power of the government, and promoting various other values that are important in any liberal democratic society. Now, let's talk next about what are the reforms that the current government wants to promote. First, a little bit about recent Israeli political history. I mentioned before that in order to form a government in Israel, you have to have 61 seats in the Knesset. If the government loses this majority, then it can fall apart and a new election has to be called, even if the government term isn't up yet. Well, in the last 4 years, Israel has had 5 different elections because every time a government forms, it falls apart within a year. The basic issue is that on one side, you have people who support Bibi Netanyahu, who is the current prime minister and the leader of the Likud party. But on the other side, you have many people who, for various reasons, really hate Bibi Netanyahu, some because they oppose his ideology, some because they think he's corrupt, and some for other kinds of reasons. So in several instances, Bibi Netanyahu was able to form a government after an election, but it quickly fell apart because he managed to anger some of the parties that were in the coalition with him. Until last November, for a year, there was a coalition of the anti-Bibi parties, but they too fell apart because they could not agree among themselves about a bunch of different issues. They had left-wing parties, right-wing parties, centrist parties, and also Arab parties, all in the same coalition, and these people found it very hard to agree. So a new election was held. In that new election, the parties that were relatively sympathetic to Bibi managed to get 64 out of 120 seats, but they managed to do that only because in some ways they got lucky. There were 2 parties, one left-wing party and one Arab party, that fell just short of the 3.25% they needed to get in order to have seats in the Knesset. Each of these parties got about 3% of the vote. So as a result, they got no seats. And so the parties that were willing to support Bibi, they ended up with a majority of the seats, even though they did not actually have a majority of the votes. And because Bibi over time had managed to alienate so many other people, he in the past, he's been in governments where he was in a coalition with left-wing parties and with centrist parties, as well as his right-wing Likud party. But the leftists and the centrists don't want to go into coalition with Bibi anymore, in part because they're really mad about how he treated them in previous coalitions that they were a part of. They feel that he broke various deals that he made with them and did a lot of other things that they didn't like. So Bibi had very little choice but to make a coalition with these very right-wing religious parties, many of whom hate the Supreme Court and want to limit its power. During the election, Bibi talked very little about the judicial reform, but in order to get these parties to go along with them, he had to promise them that he would take these measures to weaken the power of the Israeli judiciary. In addition, Bibi Netanyahu himself, for the last couple of years, he has been under indictment and under investigation for possible corruption. So in Israel, they have a very unusual situation where you can be the sitting prime minister of the country, but also under indictment and investigation for a crime. So if the government is able to weaken the power of the judiciary, that might enable Bibi to get out of the corruption trial that's currently facing him. So in addition to just keeping himself in power and keeping his government together, he also has the incentive that by pushing through reforms to weaken the judiciary, he might be able to keep himself from being convicted of crimes and ending up in prison. And obviously, it's easy to understand that he does not want to go to prison. If I were him, I would not want to go to prison either. So what are the reforms that the new government proposed soon after they came to power? There's several different parts, but the most important parts are 2 elements. The first is that the government will now be able to overturn Supreme Court decisions just by passing ordinary laws with a simple 61-vote majority in the Knesset. So if the courts rule that the government is violating a basic law and violating people's rights, now the government doesn't have to pass a new basic law to change that. They can simply, if these reforms go through, they can simply just pass a new ordinary law with a 61-vote majority saying, we don't like this decision, this decision should go away, and if we should be able to violate these rights as much as we want. The second provision is that instead of the current system where the judges are selected to a large extent by current members of the judiciary, instead they will now be selected entirely by politicians, and in practice almost entirely by whoever holds the current majority in the Knesset. So in combination, these two measures would basically kill judicial review. The government would have complete control over who sits on the courts. And even if the people in the courts make decisions that go against government policy, the government can simply overturn those decisions by passing a new law. So anybody who likes the institution of judicial review, they obviously are against these reforms. And as it turns out, many people in Israel do in fact like the institution of judicial review. As a result, over the last several months, Israel has had the largest demonstrations in the entire history of the state of Israel. More than 1 million people have been in the streets demonstrating against this on a regular basis. And this is in a society with only 9 million people in all. So it's as if in the United States, we had like 40 or 50 million people protesting. So not only is this the biggest protest in the history of Israel, proportionally, it may be one of the biggest in the entire history of the liberal democratic world. So as a result of this very strong public opposition, which is reflected not just in the demonstrations, but also in public opinion polls. Polls show that a substantial majority of Israelis oppose these reforms. For the moment, Bibi Netanyahu and his government have stopped the process of trying to adopt these reforms, and they have entered into negotiations with the opposition parties. The negotiations are run by the president of Israel. In Israel, unlike in the United States, the president does not have much real power. The president is just the ceremonial head of state, similar to the King of England. Normally what he does is, he sits at ceremonies, he waves the flag, he does various other things that are not that important. But in this case, he has become this sort of unifying figure that is trying to get the two sides to negotiate. But it's not at all clear that anything will actually come from the negotiations. And the right-wing parties in Bibi's coalition, they're trying to pressure him to stop the negotiations and start up the judicial reform process as well. So it is very hard to say what will happen with these reforms. Maybe the government will be able to push them through after all. Maybe there will be some sort of compromise, or maybe the government will actually fall, because one of the things that has happened is it turns out there are disagreements within the ruling coalition itself. And there are some people in Bibi's own party, the Likud party, who do not want to pass these reforms if they're going to be as incredibly unpopular as they currently seem to be. I should mention that the fact that the reforms are unpopular does not by itself prove that the reforms are a bad idea. I myself have written an entire book about political ignorance, where I discuss how the public often doesn't know much about government policy, and majority opinion can often be wrong. So I'm not saying these reforms are wrong merely because the majority of Israelis are against them, but the fact that a majority is not only against them, but is strongly against them, that at least makes it harder to push these reforms through. And if they do get pushed through, there will be more conflict in Israeli society. The opponents of these reforms are unlikely to just accept them and move on. And we already saw this conflict taking place over the last several months. Right now, it's to some extent suspended because of the military conflict that you already heard about from Evelina. They're fighting Palestinian terrorists both in the south and on the eastern border. But sooner or later, the fighting will die down, the real fighting will die down, and the political fighting about judicial reform will start up again. So I'd like to talk next a little bit about why it is that I am against these reforms. And I've already, I think, mentioned some of the reasons. My biggest reason is that the Israeli Supreme Court, although it certainly makes mistakes, it has done a lot to protect civil liberties in Israel, property rights, and also to protect minorities of various kinds against discrimination. That is what judicial review is supposed to do, to limit the power of political majorities and limit the oppression of individual rights. And the Israeli Supreme Court has been doing that. And in the Israeli political system, this is particularly important because, as I already mentioned, Israel is a very highly centralized political system. So if there was no judicial review, there would be few or no other safeguards against the tyranny of the majority that would emerge in Israel, or really in most countries. If there are not constitutional safeguards, they do not have federalism in Israel. They don't have separation of powers. They have almost nothing in the way of other constraints on the powers of the current political majority other than judicial review. And so in judicial review, it's especially important in Israel, even if you think it might be desirable to get rid of judicial review in the United States. And I actually don't think we should get rid of it in the United States, but in the United States, there's a better argument for getting rid of it than in Israel, because at least we have at least some other constraints on the power of majorities, which in Israel, for the most part, they do not have. I would add that this risk is especially great in a very diverse society like Israel, because in a society that is diverse, there is a great risk that political majorities will oppress and harm minorities. There are many people in the current Israeli government who want to do exactly this. Many of Bibi's coalition partners, like, for example, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's the leader of one of the parties in the coalition, they have said that one of the things they want to do is to discriminate against and oppress more secular Jews for the benefit of more religious ones, and also Arabs and others. I am a Jew myself, as I think many of you are. Jews have a long history of being a persecuted and discriminated against minority in many countries around the world, including, of course, in Russia. If it is wrong to do it in those countries, then it is equally wrong if in Israel, religious Jews are able to oppress secular Jews, or Jews are able to oppress and discriminate against Arabs, and so on. What is wrong when it is done against us is also wrong when other Jews do it to either Jews that they don't like or people who are non-Jews. And that is exactly what the Israeli government, some of the people currently in power, plan to do if they are able to destroy the system of judicial review. I would add that I would not trust the Israeli political left with absolute power either. I think they too, if they came to power and they had no constraints on them, they would do some bad things too. I think both the right and the left in Israel and in many other countries, they have these tendencies, which is why they need to be constrained by institutions like judicial review. Now, there is an argument which says that even if judicial review is permissible in the United States and in some other countries, it's not permissible in Israel because, as I said before, Israel does not have a written constitution. And so the judges in Israel, they cannot say our judicial review is authorized by the Constitution. So if you take that argument, however, then you can say exactly the same thing about the powers of the Knesset and the government and Bibi Netanyahu's government. After all, there is no written constitution authorizing their power either. The only thing they have going for them is tradition and history. And of course, Israel now also has a history of judicial review as well. So unless and until Israel does have a written constitution, then the powers of all of the parts of government, whether the Knesset or the courts, they rest on some combination of tradition and political norms. And those of us trying to judge whether those powers are good or not should ask, what are the effects of those traditions? What are the effects of those norms? And overall, I think the effect of Israeli judicial review has been a good one, and not just because they once cited one of my articles. That is not the reason why the effect is good. However, the fact that I think these reforms are a bad idea does not mean that I think everything is fine in the current Israeli political system. I think it's a bad thing that the only constraint on the majority in the central government is judicial review. I think it would be better if Israel had a system of federalism. They might also try to create a system of separation of powers. Those systems should not necessarily look exactly like the American system, but they would be desirable for them to have reforms of some kind in that area. Similarly, I think it would be good if Israel did create a written constitution so that we would more clearly spell out what rights people have and how they work. And there would then be a system of amending the Constitution that requires more than just a majority in the parliament. Yair Lapid, who was the prime minister right before Bibi Netanyahu and is now the leader of the largest opposition party, he has actually proposed that Israel create a written constitution, and there's some chance that maybe they will finally do it. If that happens, I think that would be a good result of the current political fight, but I'm not optimistic that it actually will happen. We'll see if there's any real chance of that occurring. It might also be desirable to have some reforms of the way that Israeli judges are selected. I would not want to give all the power to politicians or to the current government, like in the reform proposal. But I think it's reasonable to say that current judges should not have as much power over the selection of new judges as is the case under the current system. And I'm happy to talk about the details of how that might work in questions. The last part of the presentation, I'll talk about the implications of this for debates about judicial review here in the United States. Obviously, our system is very different from theirs. We do have a written constitution. It's not completely clear on every point, but it does say a lot of things. We also have had judicial review for over 200 years, not just 30 years like in Israel. In addition, our system is not as centralized as Israel's. We do have a federal system, and even when one party controls Congress, or the presidency, often many state governments are controlled by the opposing party, and they have some ability to resist, just as Democratic states resisted Donald Trump in some ways, and right now Republican states are resisting Joe Biden. Also, we have two houses in Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives. Sometimes, like right now, the two houses are controlled by different parties. Right now, the Democrats control the Senate and the Republicans control the House, and that makes it harder for a majority to just do whatever it wants. So in that respect, we don't have as much need for judicial review as the Israelis do. Nonetheless, I think the US Supreme Court and other lower courts have played a valuable role in American history in protecting rights and limiting government power. The courts have made lots of mistakes, but overall, I think they're better off. We're better off with the power of judicial review than we would be without it. And I can talk about why in questions if people are interested. In addition, our system of judicial selection is different from the Israeli one. In our system, federal judges are appointed by the president, but then they have to be confirmed by the Senate. That is, a majority of the Senate has to vote to approve the nomination. And that puts some constraint on the president, particularly when the Senate is controlled by the opposing political party. So even though judicial review is pretty strong in the US and for a long time, most people accepted it, there is currently a movement on the political left to try to, if not get rid of judicial review, then at least greatly weaken it. And I think there's two reasons why that movement has arisen. One reason is that American society has become more polarized. That is, the gap between the political right and the political left has become greater. And that is also reflected in the judiciary. There are bigger differences between judges appointed by Republicans and judges appointed by Democrats than there have been in the past. And so the current Supreme Court has a 6-3 conservative majority. And obviously, many political liberals don't like that and are very angry about some of the decisions the court has made, particularly its decisions about abortion rights and about guns. The second reason is what happened in 2016 and in 2020. In 2016, Justice Scalia, a conservative justice on the Supreme Court, suddenly died. President Obama appointed Merrick Garland, a liberal judge, to fill his seat. But the Senate was controlled by the Republicans. They said, we are not even going to hold hearings on this nomination. We're just going to, because it's an election year, we're going to wait to see who wins the election. They said it would be wrong to hold hearings until the election could decide the issue. This was perfectly legal, but obviously it made Democrats very angry. Then in 2020, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a liberal Supreme Court justice, she died right before the election. She actually died closer to the time of the election than Justice Scalia died relative to the election in 2016. And in 2020, Donald Trump, of course, was president, and the Republicans still controlled the Senate. And the Republicans said, this time we are going to hold hearings on the judge, even though it's just a couple weeks before the election. It doesn't matter what we did in 2016. What we're doing here is going to hold hearings. And so they did hold the hearings, and they took a vote on her, on the replacement for Justice Ginsburg, who is Justice Amy Coney Barrett. And she was confirmed and is now a justice Supreme Court. So like in 2016, what the Republicans did in 2020 was completely legal, but it made the Democrats even more mad than they were before, because they said it's completely hypocritical for the Republicans to say in 2016, we should not hold hearings on a Supreme Court nominee during an election, and then to say in 2020, we were just kidding. This year we can do it because this year we control the presidency as well as the Senate. And so some Democrats have proposed that what should be done is that the size of the Supreme Court should be increased so that President Biden could appoint more liberal justices to offset the conservative justices on the current majority. That might increase the size of the Supreme Court from 9 justices to 12 or 13 or 15. Others have proposed making it difficult or impossible for the Supreme Court to hear cases so that the Supreme Court wouldn't get an opportunity to review policies that might be unconstitutional. And some of the Democrats who propose this, they say it's just to make up for what the Republicans did in 2016 and 2020. Others say that they just want to weaken judicial review in general. In this respect, they are much like the Israeli political right. In Israel, the Supreme Court is making decisions that many on the political right don't like, so they would like to weaken it because of that. Our Supreme Court is making decisions that many people on the political left don't like, so some of them want to weaken or even get rid of judicial review for that reason. I oppose efforts to weaken judicial review in the US for much the same reasons as I oppose them in Israel. I think doing so would undermine protections for important rights and civil liberties. It would give too much power to current political majorities. And in addition, it would weaken an important protection for democracy because without judicial review, the party in power can try to change the rules to its advantage to keep itself in power. It's important to remember that during the 2020 election and immediately afterwards, the courts in the United States, including judges appointed by Republicans, managed to block Donald Trump's attempts to remain in power even though he lost the election. Many Democrats, I think, or at least some Democrats, have forgotten about that. If you had courts that were more under the control of whatever party was in power, then that would make it more likely that those courts would help that party stay in power or change the rules so as to enable them to stay in power. I will say that the danger to judicial review in the United States is right now at least smaller than it is in Israel. The Democratic Party is divided among themselves on this issue. Importantly, President Biden is not willing so far, at least, to support court packing or any of these other more radical measures that I mentioned. In addition, because we have two houses of Congress, it's much harder to enact a sweeping new law in the United States than it would be in Israel. And as I mentioned before, if judicial review was weakened in the US, the consequences would probably be less bad than in Israel, because we do have other safeguards in our system, such as federalism, separation of powers, and others. That said, I still think we are better off with strong judicial review in the United States than we would be if it were greatly weakened. And while I think some reforms in the United States might be desirable, just like in Israel, I would not want those reforms to take the form of destroying the power of judicial review. For example, I think it might be desirable to have term limits for Supreme Court justices instead of, as is currently the case, right now they can serve for their entire life. I think it might be reasonable if they had 18-year terms, but that's very different from saying that we should just get rid of their power entirely. Much more can be said about both the situation in Israel and the situation in this country, but I know I've already talked longer than I should have, so I will stop, and I will be very happy to take your questions, either in English or in Russian. Thank you very much.
Ilya, thank you very much. I would like those of you who ask questions in Russian be very succinct. And I would also like Ilya to translate those questions to English, because my ultimate goal is that our children would listen to your lecture as well. Okay?
I will do that.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ilya. Thank you very much for brief and very interesting conversation. And I have two questions. Out of the two provisions, the first one can be remedied easily by increasing the number of MKs voting for or against a particular law, like instead of 61, we have 80 or 90 MKs voting. This will provide a sufficient safeguard, in my opinion. And the second part of the second provision in question is basically bringing the Israeli judiciary system to something similar that we have here in the US. What would be, let's say, the second provision were accepted, exactly meaning that the judiciary is voted for and appointed by the politicians, what would be the difference between that and what we have in the US? Perhaps you touched on it, but I missed it. Second question is, let's say...
I thought those were the questions. Please go ahead.
One at a time.
Yeah, second question is going to be very brief. Let's say the roles reversed. The left offered the left growing power and offered something similar. What would be your opinion?
Okay. So those are three, maybe four questions. Let me try to answer them in the reverse order that you raised them. Okay. The last one is easiest. If the left proposed the same sort of thing as the right has proposed, I would be against it for much the same reasons as I am against it when the right proposes it. Indeed, the left in the United States has in fact proposed some ideas that are similar, and I'm against those. Then you ask, how is the proposal on selection of judges different from the American system? The difference is that in the Israeli system, or I'm sorry, in the Israeli proposal, not under the current system, but in the proposal by the government, the control would be entirely in the hands of the majority in the Knesset, whereas in the American system, it's divided between the president and the Senate, which means that in many situations, the Senate would be a significant constraint, especially when the Senate is controlled by a different party from the one that controls the White House. Nonetheless, I actually think that the American system probably gives too much power to politicians here as well. The Israeli system, I think, gives too much power to existing judges, but I think the solution is not to give all the power to politicians, especially not to whoever controls 61 votes in the current Knesset. On your very first question, I think you're absolutely right. If the only way to override a decision by the court was with 80 or 90 votes in the Knesset, this would be much less dangerous, but it would also mean that the current government of Israel would not get what it wants, because if they had to get to 80 or 90 votes, almost certainly they would need votes from opposition parties that are to the left of them, or that don't like Bibi Netanyahu, or that don't like his religious coalition partners. And if you look at the Israeli Knesset and its history, at least in the last 50 years, it's almost impossible to get 80 or 90 votes for anything really major and controversial. So if you had to have 80 or 90 votes to do it, then in practice, that wouldn't be that much different from the current system. I do think it might be desirable, and I said this in my presentation, for Israel to create a written constitution, which then, like the US Constitution or the Canadian Constitution, could only be amended by a supermajority. Maybe that would mean 80 or 90 votes in the Knesset. Maybe it would be some other kind of amendment system. I certainly wouldn't recommend the exact amendment process that the United States has, because there are some problems with that. So while I wouldn't have much problems with a system where 80 or 90 votes in the Knesset could override the Israeli Supreme Court, this would not satisfy Bibi Netanyahu's friends who have put together this proposal, or I should say his coalition partners. It's not clear that they actually like each other that much, but they need each other to stay in power, and an 80 or 90 vote threshold would not satisfy them, even though it might satisfy me.
Okay, thank you, Ilya.
The question is, I'm just translating into English. The question is, does the Israeli Supreme Court have any lawmaking power in the United States? The questioner says the Supreme Court does not have the power to make laws. And when it tried, you ended up with the Dred Scott decision, which of course led to very negative consequences. And now I'm going to answer the question. Officially, neither the Israeli Supreme Court nor the US Supreme Court has the power to make law, except maybe in a very few highly unusual areas. Both courts, if you read their decisions, they say all we're doing is we're interpreting the existing law or the existing constitution. Now, critics of the US Supreme Court and also of the Israeli Supreme Court, they say that many times when the court says that it's just interpreting the law, that they're actually making law, and they're just making decisions based on their own preferences. And I think their own preferences can and do influence them sometimes in cases, especially where the law is unclear, as some parts of the Constitution in the US are unclear, and some parts of the Israeli basic law also aren't always clear. So I think there is some ideological bias and political bias that exists among judges, both in the United States and in Israel and in other countries too. That said, I think there is still less bias than there is among politicians when they control everything. And certainly both in the US and in Israel, courts have often made important decisions that go against what might be the political preferences of the judges who made them. I already mentioned the very important recent example where Republican appointed judges, including on the Supreme Court, rejected Donald Trump's lawsuits trying to overturn the result of the 2020 election. And there are many other examples like that. So I think there is bias among judges. And sometimes they are influenced by political factors, but they nonetheless, as a general rule, are more objective and less biased than politicians are.
What specifically situation in Israeli Supreme Court?
So I think you are referring to the principle of reasonability, which is a standard that the Israeli Supreme Court uses in some areas to assess laws. I think anytime a court imposes a standard which is not highly precise, there is a danger of bias, but that's unavoidable in some legal decision making because if you ask judges and legal scholars, they will tell you there are some legal rules which are clear, bright line rules. For example, in the state where I live, you have to be 16 years old to get a driver's license. But there are many other legal rules which are actually not clear, bright lines, but are standards. For example, the standard for liability in many situations is what would a reasonable person do? And so I think it's unavoidable in some cases the courts have to apply standards like that because not everything can be decided by very clear, precise, bright lines. And when they apply standards like that, there is the danger that they might be biased or their decisions might be unclear or other problems will arise. I think it's better to live with those problems than to destroy the system of judicial review and just let the currently dominant politicians do whatever they want. Even though I certainly agree, courts will sometimes be biased and will sometimes just make mistakes when they apply these standards.
Thank you, Ilya. Lana Goodin will ask question, and then my question will be the last one because we are approaching 9 o'clock. Lana, please be brief.
Yeah, brief is not. It's not the real case here because there are certain things that I would like to discuss. First off,
would you please? It's not a discussion time. Would you please formulate your question?
In the United States, we have the right of the Congress to push back. It takes 2/3 of the Congress to push back on the decisions that made by the Supreme Court in cases there is a disagreement. At the same time, you said that 9,000 people that protested this law, it's the power and it's very good because they expressed. So you kind of afford when you're against it because it's also rule majority to have 9,000 people. So it's a mob rule. That it was
Lana,
not like that.
Lana,
yes.
Excuse me. Would you please ask your question?
I cannot ask my question without.
Thank you.
I'm happy to answer what you already said, if that will help. I think you misunderstood what I said, and also you have some factual things wrong. In the United States, it is not possible to overturn a decision of the Supreme Court simply with a 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress. You also need 3/4 of states to agree to pass a constitutional amendment. I actually think that this makes constitutional amendments too difficult, but that is what the current system is. Secondly, I did not say that 9,000 people protesting in Israel, that by itself proves that the legal reforms are wrong. To the contrary, I said the exact opposite. I said that just because a majority of Israelis is against this, this does not prove that this does not by itself prove that the reforms are wrong. And I would add that it's not 9,000. It's actually more than 1 million Israelis who have been protesting. The total population of Israel, as I said before, is about 9 million. But I do not believe that simply the number of people who are for or against a policy tells us a lot about whether it's a good idea or not. So I think I've been very consistent in my view that I think liberal democratic societies like the United States and Israel, they should have constitutional constraints on the power of political majorities that are enforced by judicial review. And I think that's true regardless of the number of people who are protesting. At the same time, I also think it should be possible to amend constitutions. And while an amendment process should require much more than just a simple majority, maybe it should require less than the truly overwhelming supermajority that is needed to amend the United States Constitution. So if Israel were to have a written constitution, probably they wouldn't listen to me, but if they were to have one and they wanted my advice, I would advise them to make it a little bit easier to amend the Constitution than is possible with the United States Constitution right now.
Thank you, Ilya. Considering that we have a couple of minutes left, I'll ask my question. Actually, I have a proxy from several people to ask this question. So if Netanyahu literally colluded with non-friends, let's put it this way, because coalition party was not his party, or a couple of parties were not his parties. does it mean that he is now a puppet in the hands of religious party that
I
basically
think it's
meant him to deliver the favors that he promised?
So I think it's an overstatement to say that he is their puppet, but he does have a strong incentive to try to give them what they want, because if he doesn't give them what they want, they might leave the coalition and the government would fall. If the government were to fall right now, the very likely result is that the opponents of Netanyahu would get a majority in the Knesset, or at least that's what the polls in Israel say. The polls say they would get 62 or 63 seats, and they would be, and not only that, but the investigation and prosecution of Netanyahu himself would continue, and there's a good chance, it's not certain, but there's a good chance that he would end up in prison. So he has a lot of incentive to give the religious parties what they want. On the other hand, however, they have some incentive not to push him too far, because if the government falls, that would be bad for Bibi, but it would also be bad for them, because if the government falls and the current opposition parties return to power, they would likely adopt various policies that these religious parties would not like. So as I see it, in Israel, we really have two different sets of conflicts and negotiations going on. One is the conflict between the current government and the opposition over judicial reform, but the other is a negotiation and perhaps even a conflict within the current government where Bibi would like to do enough to satisfy the religious parties so that they will keep him in power, but not so much that he angers everybody else and therefore is likely to lose the next election. And, this is a difficult situation for him. And, I'm not sure that I would be able to handle it particularly well if I were in his place. But his personal problems, I think, are less of a danger than the problem that this creates for the entire Israeli political system and population, in that this judicial reform has created a massive conflict. And also, if it goes through, it would be dangerous for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. So it's an overstatement, I think, to say that he's just a puppet of those religious parties. But on the other hand, he is dependent on them, but they, for their part, are dependent on him, because it's very unlikely that if the opposition comes to power, that they will be willing to include these religious parties. Most of the parties in the opposition right now are people who really do not like the religious parties, and after the judicial reform effort, they're even more angry at those religious parties than they were before. So that's the situation, or at least that's a simplified summary of what is going on.
Ilya, thank you very much. Actually, it was a wonderful presentation. I think each of us will listen to the recording not once, to allow everything to sink in. And if everything goes well, we will continue the legal theme next week, right?
Yeah, to talk about a very different topic.
Yes, very different, but still legal. Okay, thank you, Ilya, very much. And for those of you who would like to stay and continue, we will allow for another 30 minutes.
Okay.
If you would like to disconnect, please disconnect.
Thank you very much. Большое вам спасибо.
Вам спасибо.
До скорой встречи в эфире.
Спасибо вам.
Спасибо большое.